Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I am so excited to be here with Graham Watson for the third time. Third time's the charm, because we've had so much fun talking about his book, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë, and there's just always more to talk about. So that's why we're here for the third time, and we know that there are hardcore fans here and people that are just learning about Charlotte Brontë and Emily Brontë now that the new movie is out. So we'll be talking about that. But before we get started, I just want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We really appreciate them. And we appreciate Graham, who for the third time has let us share this program with other libraries because, of course, when libraries work together, we make magic. You can buy signed books by Graham from our favorite indie bookstore, the Aesop's Fable in Holliston. I'll put a link to that in the recap email I send out to everybody. Graham does have slides, as you can see, and he's going to be talking for about 30 to 45 minutes, and I'll be turning the chat off during that time so we're not distracted. If you have questions, though, for him, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, and I will moderate those after the slides. So Graham Watson has like hit the big time with this book. I mean, it is everywhere, not just the book, but the renewed interest in the Brontes, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But there's always interest, but it seems like it just comes in waves. And your book just came out at exactly the right time to catch that wave. And so I'm so excited that you're here again, Graham. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mina. I love doing this, and as you say, this is the third time. So, welcome to everyone who's joined previously and who's come back. Thank you to some. I see some names there that I recognise, so thank you all. As Mina says, the Brontes is one of those never-ending subjects. It just goes on through time, but also it's limitless in terms of what we can talk about, or at least what I can talk about. I'm going to demonstrate that tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, my book, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë. Some of you who've been here for parts 1 and 2 will have heard me say some of this before, but I'm going to recap it for the newbies who are joining us so that we aren't lost by it all. So I'm going to talk about that. I'll talk a little bit about Emily Brontë as well. You might have heard of the new movie of Wuthering Heights that's out. We'll discuss some of that, and we'll discuss how ideas of Emily Brontë originated in historical research, and some of them originated in Elizabeth Gaskell's own research for her book, The Life of Charlotte Brontë, and how it's been perpetuated over time and sometimes changed. We'll be looking at original sources that I looked at for my research for my book, and some of them were the same that Elizabeth Gaskell saw. So I'm going to switch over to slides. As Mina said, please feel free to ask questions. There will be lots of people who have lots of questions, and I'm happy to talk about anything related to the Brontes. It doesn't have to be specifically about this book or my talk. Ask anything you like. Ask those burning questions that you've always wanted to ask about the Brontes, because my research was fairly extensive and not just limited to the period that I've written about. So I might know the answer. Please do ask. So I'm going to switch on to slides now, and here we are. I hope you can see them. As Mina says, my name's Graham Watson. I'm the author of The Invention of Charlotte Brontë. As I said, I'm going to talk today about the research that is behind my book, including manuscripts and 19th century newspapers. And we're also going to look at Wuthering Heights, Emily Brontë, and someone's saying no slides yet. Okay.
I'm seeing them fine. Catherine, if you want to try, I'll text you, not text you, but I'll put something in the chat for you, Catherine.
Okay, so can everyone else see them? Just before we proceed, I I hope everyone can, because no, someone else, Maria says no. Okay, are you seeing me, Maria?
I am seeing it. Do you want to go out of the
Can you
slides
also
and
see?
come back in?
Yeah, I can do that. So let's see. Maybe if we stop the screen share and then restart it, Mina, shall we try that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So I'll stop sharing and then I'll start sharing again. Share. Someone said what? Let's see, screen share and share. So can everyone see that image?
I
Uh,
see it. Okay,
Maria,
we're
can you
good.
see
I
it?
think we're good. Yep.
Yeah, okay, so we'll go from the beginning. Yeah, there's thumbs up. That's good enough. So come on, there we are. Oh yeah, that's working now. Okay, everyone sees that. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about my own research for my book, and we're also going to look at Wuthering Heights and the mythology around Emily Brontë. I am going to try and get through lots of things. There's a lot to talk about, but we might hopefully will be able to take lots of questions as well. So my book is called The Invention of Charlotte Brontë. These are the two editions of it, the US and the UK editions. The book is about principally these two women, Charlotte Brontë and Elizabeth Gaskell, and I'm going to talk about them in very basic terms for the new people who've joined us. Charlotte Brontë was the author of Jane Eyre, amongst other novels. She lived and died in the early part of the 19th century, and Elizabeth Gaskell was also a novelist, an English novelist at the same time. Author of Wives and Daughters, Cranford, Mary Barton, many other books. But for me, what's very interesting about Elizabeth Gaskell is that she wrote the very first biography of Charlotte Brontë. She was a friend of Charlotte Brontë. She'd known her for 5 years in person, 6 years if you count the year they corresponded with each other. And so she was able to inform her biography with first-hand knowledge of Charlotte Brontë and Charlotte's father. She visited Charlotte's hometown of Haworth and interviewed everyone then living who'd known Charlotte Brontë. Now, this sounds like a very straightforward story, but it's not, because when the book was published, when Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë was published, it caused a huge amount of controversy. Victorian readers were scandalised by it. And not only were they scandalised, but many of the people who'd been named in the book were horrified about what Elizabeth Gaskell had written about them and threatened to sue Elizabeth Gaskell. A deal was reached, which essentially appeased those people who complained, but damaged Elizabeth Gaskell's reputation forever. And the common received wisdom is that Elizabeth Gaskell was a journalist and a biographer who was faulty, that she took at face value many things she shouldn't have accepted, that she was unreliably informed and she was misled by her sources. And I say this is not true, and we can actually demonstrate it through an examination of the first-hand evidence. So therefore, my book has destabilized lots of things that people have accepted as historical truths about the Brontes, because we've always been led to believe that Gaskell was wrong on many things. And I say Gaskell was framed. So I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about historical context. But before we do that, we'll acknowledge that there is a film about Wuthering Heights. You may have heard about it. It's based on Emily Bronte's novel. It has, you could say, had a mixed response in the press. There's lots of hate about this movie, and equally a lot of love for it as well. We're going to talk about how that began and why people feel so passionately about Emily Brontë and about this book and its reincarnations over time. To do that, we have to go back to the sources, and those can be letters, they can be printed books. I'll talk about the terms I'll use will be primary sources, which are those written manuscripts that you can see, and secondary sources, which is anything that's printed, basically, that's written by someone long after the fact. Those secondary sources include many biographies of the Brontes. Elizabeth Gaskell's book sits between those two because she was someone who'd known the Brontes personally. Though her book is a secondary source, it's her opinion. So it's a link, it's a juncture between the two fields. Let's talk about who they are. So again, for contextual purposes, these are the Bronte sisters. They lived in the first half of the 19th century. In this image, we see Anne, Emily, and Charlotte Bronte, painted by their brother Branwell. The damage that you can see in this image was created by improper care and handling of the painting through the late 19th century, after it was inherited by Charlotte Bronte's widower. Most of us are familiar with this very iconic image, and the ghostly pillar in the centre there is Branwell Bronte. There are many theories about why Branwell painted it himself out. Some people say that Charlotte Bronte painted him out. Charlotte tends to get the blame for everything. She is the Bronte family scapegoat then and now. But X-rays have shown that the painting of Branwell that's underneath that layer of paint is only a sketch. So that suggests, because the others are in various shades of completion, that he changed his mind very early on and painted himself out. The image of Branwell isn't complete behind that. And neither actually are the two figures of Emily and Anne. It's only the Charlotte figure that's complete on the right there. The others needed a bit more layering. So if you ever see this painting in person, or if you look at a digital image of it, you can actually see the pencil lines around Emily and Anne's eyes and mouth. And that's because Branwell hadn't added the next layer of definition. They lived here in Haworth Parsonage. Haworth is a small village in Yorkshire in England. It's sort of almost in the centre of England. It's a very moorland, hilly environment. This is how it looked in about 1857. This photograph was taken then. So it's the time of the Brontes. Now it looks slightly different. It's a museum. The trees were all planted at a later point, and those extensions were added by a vicar who followed Patrick Bronte's footsteps and got Patrick Bronte's job after he died, essentially. It's suitably Gothic, isn't it? The churchyard around the house and the low buildings and the church tower struck many people when they came to visit Haworth. And this image, drawn by Elizabeth Gaskell's daughter, Meta, is like and also not like the reality. Those mountains in the background don't actually exist. There are hills around Haworth, around the parsonage, but they're much lower. But we can see an exaggeration happening. Everything's been elongated. The house has been made to look like a cottage. We can see a tone has been brought in to suggest something atmospheric. Their father was Patrick Brontë, who was the vicar, rather the curate of Haworth. He was the father of 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. They were Charlotte, Emily, Branwell, and Anne. He was an Anglican vicar who came from Ireland. I'm going to mention various figures so that we are aware of who they are as I talk through this. So, yes, he survived all of his children. Branwell was the only son of the family. He was a promising artist and painter. Someone who's much blamed actually in the legacy of the Brontes as being a ne'er-do-well or a drunkard. He was a young man who had problems, and in my opinion, his problems weren't as different to many problems that young men face today, where they feel that they don't have a niche in life. They have much creativity, but can only find dead-end jobs with that creativity. And for Branwell, that was very much the case. He drifted from job to job, found an unsatisfactory relationship, and his life became destabilized. And he ultimately died of his addictions, or as the Victorians called it, his vices. Another figure that's going to be important in this discussion today is this lady, Ellen Nussey. Ellen was Charlotte Bronte's closest friend for at least 27 years. She came from a wealthy family in Yorkshire. She and Charlotte met when they were students at a boarding school at age 13 and 14. She's important to our understanding of the Brontes in history because she is the key witness. She described herself as being the coal mine through which all Bronte biographers mine their ore. She was the seam through which it was all drawn. It's not entirely true, but I do get her point, that she became the key witness that all journalists and biographers of the 19th century wanted to speak to. She was one of Elizabeth Gaskell's key sources for her life of Charlotte Brontë. But this commitment to keeping the Bronte name alive in history came with considerable costs for Ellen Nussey. She was cut off by Patrick Brontë and Arthur Nichols, Charlotte Bronte's widower, and they never spoke to her again after it became clear that she'd assisted Elizabeth Gaskell quite extensively. And later in life, she was subject to many attempts to rip her off and to steal artifacts from her. This is Arthur Nichols, who was Charlotte Bronte's husband for the last 9 months of her life. He was also a curate. Like Charlotte's father, he also came from Ireland. He had 2 terms as Patrick Bronte's assistant. So Patrick Bronte was his boss, if you like, between May 1845 and May 1853. And then he resigned when it became clear that Patrick Bronte objected to his relationship with Charlotte Bronte. Arthur left his job and left town. And then a year later, after he'd renegotiated the relationship with Charlotte, and she was much more amenable to having it, and a peace deal, if you like, could be brokered out between Charlotte, Arthur, and her father, he came back and was there until Patrick Bronte's death in 1861, when he was told that he would no longer be needed and someone else would replace him. The Vicar of Bradford decided to replace him with someone else, even though Arthur expected to live in the parsonage for the rest of his life. He wasn't. He was essentially kicked out. He returned home to Ireland, but he took with him many of the Bronte artifacts, including manuscripts, those paintings that we saw earlier, and really refused to talk about the family until the 1890s. So for about 40 years, he didn't say anything and wouldn't speak about them. We're glad he did, because he had some valuable information to share. This is Elizabeth Gaskell. I don't know if my box covers up her face here. Novelist, campaigner, and friend of Charlotte Brontë, and she's the first-hand witness to much of Charlotte's own descriptions of her own life. Charlotte talked about her life extensively with Elizabeth Gaskell. Gaskell was a judicious woman. She was no fool. She had a very clear sight when it came to personalities, and that's demonstrated in her wonderful novels. Lots of Bronte fans experience Elizabeth Gaskell as a character in the Bronte story, and some of them then go into her novels and find them to be very expansive, political, socially concerned, and moral books as well. So she was someone who's, in some ways, history's underestimated, because she's been relegated in some ways to the secondary league of novelists. She's not in the same it's not in the same rank as Dickens or George Eliot. In my opinion, she is. But so I'd like to see a revival of interest in Elizabeth Gaskell. We're going to look at manuscript material from the Brontes themselves and from their associates. This is material that I examined that in person in archives that are all over the world, and much of it was looked at by Elizabeth Gaskell herself. So I was able to handle the material that she looked at when she was writing her biography, and I was able to look at that as well as many other pieces of information that she didn't see. We'll talk first of all about the writing of the life of Charlotte Brontë and the controversy that greeted its publication. So yeah, it was published in 1857, just a few years after Charlotte Bronte's death, 2 years, in fact, after her death. And it's remained a classic. However, it's treated as contested history. That's right. That's a correct way to look at it. But the background is complex. Primarily, Elizabeth Gaskell looked at letters that were donated by Ellen Nussey. This is a letter written by Charlotte Brontë. We can see Ellen has scored out some bits and pieces here, and that's Ellen censoring the names of people she didn't want Elizabeth Gaskell to know about. So Ellen already, when Elizabeth Gaskell began to interview her, she already had an idea that this was going to become public property and she had to protect people. So there's an editorializing already happening before Gaskell has even started writing. Gaskell's manuscript of the life of Charlotte Brontë still exists, and this is the first 2 pages of it. I was able to see that thanks to the University of Manchester, who own it now. And you can see that it's full of corrections and changes of mind. The whole manuscript is like that, and it's cut into sections where she's decided that something had to go. There was, of course, no computers at that point, so everything had to be done by hand and in pen and ink. It became this book, The Life of Charlotte Brontë, which The Spectator, amongst many other newspapers, called one of the most profoundest tragedies of modern life. The general public were fascinated by who the author of Jane Eyre could have been. There was much speculation about her, and had been for at least 4 or 5 years when Charlotte Brontë died in 1855. So they were primed for this story. There was an assumption that Jane Eyre had been lifted directly from Charlotte Bronte's own life, or Currer Bell's own life, as she was known then. And Elizabeth Gaskell had that in mind when she wrote this book. So the pacing of it reads a bit like a novel. Here's a newspaper article, advertisement from the time, advertising the book, just published I found this in a newspaper of 25th of March, 1857. And it's interesting that it calls it Mrs. Gaskell's Memoirs of Currer Bell, not a biography. So you can see then at the time, people are already assuming that this is Gaskell's own recollections of Charlotte Brontë. In many ways it is, but Gaskell keeps herself out of the story until the very end. Controversy was immediate, but the public appetite, as I mentioned, about the life of the anonymous author of Jane Eyre was quite high. This is an original review from the time, calling it that strange, exciting, mysterious book, Jane Eyre, which fascinated even where it shocked. We might not realise today that Jane Eyre, along with a book like Wuthering Heights, was considered shocking, and that it shouldn't be just left for anyone to read, because some of it was considered to be revolutionary in its nature in terms of how it dealt with relationships between men and women, or between an individual and authority, that all of these things could be challenged by a sole individual. For a Victorian audience, that was a shocking thing to hear, an audience that was used to establishments and had faith in establishments like the church, like the aristocracy, like educational establishments, and in government. Much faith was put in all of these institutions. And Jane Eyre seemed to be striking out a challenge to all of them. And Gaskell was a bit of a radical in that respect as well, and repeats that same tone in her Life of Charlotte Brontë. As I say, complaints began within days of the book's publication, mainly from people who had been named in the book. One of Gaskell's intentions was to shame many of the people that she felt had mistreated or abused or taken for granted Charlotte Brontë in her life. She deliberately named many of the people that she had a grievance against, and she told her publisher, have your lawyers on standby. She already knew that people would think that some of it was slanderous. This particular letter to the newspaper, to the editor of the Evening Standard, is by W. Carys Wilson, who's the son of the Reverend Carys Wilson, who readers of Jane Eyre will know as Mr. Brocklehurst. He was the headmaster of Cowan Bridge School, which Charlotte Brontë immortalised as Lowood in Jane Eyre. Gaskell not only named the headmaster as the Reverend Carys Wilson, but named the school as well, named the real-life counterparts. This was seen to be quite a shocking expose, and she hadn't prepared anyone that she was going to do this except for her publisher. So all of these people who were named were caught off guard. He was one of the first complainants. There were more. The exposure that Elizabeth Gaskell made of the Brontë family's domestic life was equally shocking to people who were used to biographies that talked about public works in a very deferential way. Gaskell was happy to share the private thoughts of Charlotte Brontë and the individual interactions between members of the family and with the outside world, which were sometimes problematic or complicated, not always good in terms of how they were treated by other people. And so people had a problem with that, and they thought it was a kind of indecent exposure, that the doors of a private house were blown open for the public to discuss. This is really the first time this happens in culture. We're also used to invasions of privacy with things like social media, where people are putting their lives online. In this age, in the 1850s, that did not happen, and people were very reserved generally. I am making generalizations. But in terms of the media, there wasn't a kind of press intrusion even into the lives of public individuals who were treated with a kind of deferential respect. And there was seen to be a gap between what the public could be interested in and what a private individual could keep to themselves. But it was details like this one that we have in the centre here. This is in defence of Patrick Brontë, because Elizabeth Gaskell repeated many anecdotes that she'd heard about Patrick Brontë, and she knew him. She'd known him as long as she'd known Charlotte Brontë. She knew him in person, so she was she wasn't venerable towards him, let's put it like that. But this is one of the bone of contentions that people still have, that she wasn't respectful about him. They feel that she should have been. We can see here that this article says, it seems as cruel to us as it was unnecessary to publish to the world his faults of temper and harsh treatment of his children. Now, this is a really important point, actually, because what this highlights is the invasion of privacy and Gaskell's writing about Patrick Brontë without his consent. That, I think, is a more important question. Should she have done it without his consent? Probably not. But was what she reported true? I believe it is. I believe it is. So presented with the prospect of going to court in the face of all these people who were complaining about libel, Elizabeth Gaskell's publisher told her they could go to court and lose, probably. It would have been one of the most sensational trials of the 19th century had it happened, because it would have meant calling as witnesses people like Patrick Brontë, like the Brontë family servant, Martha Brown, like Lydia Robinson, who was rumoured to have had an affair with Charlotte Bronte's brother. Elizabeth Gaskell didn't name her, but she did indicate her well enough for her to complain as well and threaten to sue Elizabeth Gaskell for slander. George Smith, who was Elizabeth Gaskell's publisher, knew that they could go to court and it would be sensational, but they would absolutely not win, because much of the information Elizabeth Gaskell had received was subjective. It had come through interviews, and so it could be treated as hearsay in a court. Gaskell was then faced with the challenge of either paying out complainants or issuing an apology and saying she'd made mistakes. So that's what she did. She said she'd been misled. She had been told things that she should have questioned, and it was her fault, and she apologized. So she retracted everything that was controversial about her book. The book was banned. It was withdrawn from sale, not before it almost sold out, and a new edition was prepared that made corrections. This happened twice in 6 months. Now, the question around that and the legitimacy of that has never really been examined until now. Excuse me. Because people have taken that as the final word. Gaskell admitted her errors, and so therefore she was in the wrong. Patrick Brontë was a nice person. Branwell didn't have an affair with Lydia Robinson, and so on and so on. Now, many of the things that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote about in Life of Charlotte Brontë have been proven to be correct. But people will still castigate her. Even today on social media, I see posts about Life of Charlotte Brontë as being a book filled with lies. Once we understand the political action of appeasement that Gaskell had to either make a false confession of error or make a ruinous payment to everyone who was complaining about her, we understand that she wasn't confessing from a position of truth, that she was being coerced and that she was being forced into a corner. She expressed regret about doing it, but nevertheless, it's what happened. My book explores how she was driven to that point and then the aftermath. As I say, it's the established wisdom that she was mistaken, and I hope my book proves otherwise. This is some of the documentary evidence. I'm going to give you examples of the handwriting of everyone involved. Top left here is a letter to Elizabeth Gaskell by Charlotte Brontë, talking about reading Cranford, actually. And then we have an example of Ellen Nussey's hand. This is Emily Brontë, top right rather. No, top left, as you see it. That's from her poem, And Like Myself, Lone, Wholly Lone. And below that is an example of Anne Bronte's handwriting from one of her poetry notebooks. Patrick Bronte's very elaborate and quite elegant hand here on the left-hand side of the screen here. This is from a letter that he wrote in the last weeks of Charlotte Bronte's life, actually, telling one of Charlotte's friends that his daughter's going to get better. He clearly did not know that she was going to die. In fact, no one knew that. Charlotte was, from what we can establish, suffering from a severe form of morning sickness. There was a 19th century idea that she had tuberculosis, and that was assumed because she had sisters who died of tuberculosis. Well, in fact, all 4 of her sisters died of tuberculosis. At that time in the 19th century, tuberculosis wasn't fully understood as a transmissible disease and was thought to be something that was inherent or inherited in the body. So it would erupt and then start consuming the body. That's where the term consumption comes from. But it was something that lay latent in the body. There are Victorian biographies of the Brontes right up until the end of the 19th century that say that they inherited tuberculosis from their mother. A nonsense idea that was refuted ultimately by science, but it informs people's ideas of how they were vulnerable and sickly because they'd always been fragile. It's simply not true. Charlotte's sisters died of an infectious disease, and she seems to have died of severe morning sickness. One of the things to bear in mind about that diagnosis is that Patrick Brontë had seen all four of his children die of tuberculosis. And if we were to imagine that Charlotte did die of tuberculosis, we have to wonder why he didn't see that, why he didn't recognize it, and why he was telling people weeks before she died, my daughter will get better soon. He put off Ellen Nussey from visiting because he felt she was going to recover, when she was actually in the terminal stage of her life. She was examined by 3 doctors who said that her sickness, her vomiting, was related to her condition. And this was relayed to Elizabeth Gaskell. This letter on the bottom right is from Branwell Brontë. Interestingly, there's a little sketch in the middle there, if you can see, of Haworth Church. But these illustrations that Branwell included are quite commonplace in his letters. But again, a very distinct hand there. Speaking of Branwell, this is a letter from Arthur Nichols to show you his handwriting. This letter was written in the 1880s when one of Branwell Bronte's friends had asked Arthur if he could have the medallion, which you can see here in this image, or have a photograph of it. That medallion's hanging up in the Brontë parsonage, and Arthur refused to part with it. Interestingly, in Branwell's papers, here's Branwell's own caricature of that same medallion, which is hanging in the Brontë Museum. And I think it shows us how Branwell saw himself and how other people saw him. The medallion is a bit more noble than how Branwell presented himself. I think it also shows that Branwell had quite a sense of humour. Elizabeth Gaskell here describing her concerns about the condition of Haworth. And this is just as an example of Charlotte Bronte's working manuscripts. That in the top left-hand corner is a draft of Emma, Charlotte Bronte's unfinished novel. These are relative sizes, so that's the full-page manuscript of Jane Eyre versus the quarter-page manuscript that Charlotte used in draft. So the Jane Eyre manuscript was written in ink. That was the fair copy that was presented to publishers, and the draft was written in pencil. Charlotte, we know, did that with all of her novels, wrote them in small pieces of paper and pencil, and then rewrote the whole thing in ink, as we can see here. These fortunately survive. The manuscripts of Emily and Anne's novels weren't preserved by their publishers, so we don't have those. And it's only because Charlotte's publisher preserved hers that we still have them today. Patrick Brontë was actually the first to praise Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë. As I say, as you see here, he says, "You've not only given a picture of my dear daughter Charlotte, but of my dear wife and all my dear children, and such a picture too as is full of truth and life, which could only have come from a skillful female hand." He wasn't happy, of course, about the more personal comments about himself and called them a few trifling mistakes and asked her to correct them, and she did do that. Nevertheless, there were people on the other side of the argument, like Ellen Nussey, who wondered why people like Arthur Nichols and Patrick Brontë would want to have anything about themselves concealed. She was of the mind that Charlotte Brontë had been treated as a kind of serf in her own household by these men who didn't understand her talent. Gaskell, as well, said memorably to someone, "No one can know all Charlotte Brontë had to go through. The merciful judgment of all connected with her terrible life lies with God, and we might be thankful that it does." Ellen Nussey wholeheartedly agreed with that statement. Letters and manuscripts aren't the only source. Digitization and archives allow us to look at newspapers from the time, and I read all of the daily newspapers for the period that my book covers, which is 1850 to 1857. My research actually covered a 20-year period on either side, and I established a very firm foundation of the Brontes' lives up to the point that my book covers, and then afterwards, so that I could situate it in a very solid context. But we'll look at some of those. Now, here's an example of an interview that was carried out a few years after Patrick Bronte's death, written by a person who'd known the whole family in Haworth, and it appeared in the Halifax Courier of February 29th, 1868. And it has descriptions of Anne Brontë, which is very unusual, Emily, Branwell, Patrick, and Charlotte. The interviewer says, yes, they were a very reserved family and very peculiar in their habits. Of course, nobody knew that the young ladies were writing books or that they'd become famous until long after. Strange people had begun to come to Haworth. The strange people, including myself, have never stopped coming to Haworth. But the Brontes were, like many families then and now, who put personal announcements in the newspapers, and researchers like myself can find them now. This is actually the announcement of Anne Bronte's death in Scarborough. It was published a week or so after she died in the York Herald of June 9th, 1849. And you can see the part that's highlighted here. Same day at Scarborough in her 29th year, Anne, daughter of the Reverend Patrick Brontë, incumbent of Haworth. Anne had been buried by this point, so it wasn't to announce her funeral to anyone, but to tell everyone who knew her that she had died. She died of tuberculosis in Scarborough. But again, this information that's preserved in the historical newspapers is valuable to people like me, especially because it highlights things like this. It was presumed by many people that Branwell Brontë had gone to his grave without publishing anything, but newspapers have actually preserved an interesting fact about him. Here you can see on the left-hand side, I've highlighted it in a slightly different colour, a poem published by Branwell Brontë. It's this one here, Caroline, on Caroline. What this demonstrates actually is that he was the first of the Brontë siblings to get into print. He published in 1841, June 1841. So that's 5 years before the Brontë sisters published their collected poems in Poems by Currer, Ellison, Acton Bell. He published many poems. We've found at least 19 poems by him in local newspapers of the time. What's interesting is that he didn't tell his family about them. I'll tell you how we know that. They're all signed Northumberland. None of them are signed Patrick Branwell Brontë, which was his full name. We can link that name, Northumberland, to manuscript evidence. There it is in a letter written by Branwell to one of his friends, which says, sorry, I'm moving this around. I don't know if you can see that. For mercy's sake, come and see me, for I've sought you till I dare not risk my knee, my eyesight anymore. This isn't, the strange thing about this is it's written in quite an erratic hand, but there's the Northumberland name. We actually think this might have been a prank that Branwell was playing because it's not written in his handwriting. We think he was trying to dupe one of his friends. Again, showing Branwell's sense of humour and showing that he had this good camaraderie with his friends. But there's that name again, Northumberland, up at the top of this drawing done by Branwell Brontë. The name actually occurs through Branwell's childhood writings. It was his pen name. So we know that that is Branwell Brontë, the author of those poems. This letter, interestingly, by Branwell to one of his friends says, Northumberland has so long wrought on in secret and silence that he dare not take your kind encouragement in the light of which vanity would prompt him to do. What Branwell means there is that while his friends knew that he was publishing poems under the name of Northumberland, again, that date, 1842, years before the sisters were publishing, while his friends knew that he was publishing poems, his family did not. We don't know why Branwell chose to keep it secret. It's a matter of speculation. Speaking of Branwell Brontë, was he the real author of Wuthering Heights? Because this is something that I keep seeing on social media at the moment. Now with the discussions of Wuthering Heights because of the movie, this question is coming up again. This is Here we have lots of examples of people questioning whether Emily Brontë was the author of Wuthering Heights and whether in fact it was Branwell. Well, with everything that's produced in history, it will have a source either in the written record or a source in the secondary sources, the biographies that were written, the histories that were written after the fact. Well, what we can establish is that there's a pattern that evolved. This is the very first claim that Branwell wrote Wuthering Heights, published in 1879 by one of his friends, Francis Grundy, who remembered that Branwell was reading from a manuscript. But more important, that a novel manuscript, that is, and he assumed that that novel must be Wuthering Heights because he says in that top caption there, it's well nigh incredible that a book so marvellous in its strength and in its dissection of the most morbid passions of diseased minds could have been written by a young girl like Emily Brontë. So we can see at that point Emily being disqualified because she was a woman and because she was a curate's daughter. She was seen to be innocent and naive, and therefore, how could she have produced this masterpiece that people thought was monstrous? A few years later, another biographer picks this up, Agnes Mary Robinson, who wrote the very first biography of Emily Brontë. She spoke to Ellen Nussey, who you remember me talking about earlier, for her information about Emily. But crucially, Mary Robinson says, how can I let people think that the very baseness of Heathcliff are the inventions of an experienced girl? How can I explain the existence of Wuthering Heights only by explaining Branwell? This is picked up again by a subsequent writer, again, someone who'd known Branwell Brontë, who agrees with this and assumes that Emily Brontë was disqualified as the author and it must be by a man, it must be by Branwell Brontë. Well, we know that it's not the case. Branwell's friend was amassing information about him. These are manuscript letters by Francis Leyland, who was a friend of Branwell Brontë and who wrote the first biography of him. In fact, the one that we see here. We know that a confusion's happened here. Branwell did write or started writing a novel called And the Weary Are at Rest, and it still exists. He didn't finish it. He didn't get very far with it, actually. And it's that people remember him reading from. But their assumptions that Emily Brontë as a woman and a young woman could not have written Wuthering Heights informed their speculation that he had written it. So the two things were conflated and then repeated. And they were repeated as long ago as the 1870s and are still reoccurring today. And it's extraordinary to me that even though this was debunked back then by people like Ellen Nussey, it's still appearing on social media. And it's an example of how sometimes myths will stick regardless of how they're debunked. Let's look at Emily Brontë while we're on the subject of Wuthering Heights, because obviously it is the #1 movie in the world at the moment. One of the main sources, the biographical sources about Emily Brontë, was this lady, Ellen Nussey, who Elizabeth Gaskell had interviewed fairly extensively for her biography of Charlotte Brontë. What I talk about here is just how quickly the plan to write Charlotte Bronte's biography happened. Ellen proposed it on June the 6th, 1855, which is just 8 weeks after Charlotte's funeral. She had seen scurrilous articles in the newspapers and asked the remaining Brontë family, that is Patrick and Arthur Nicholls, if someone would correct these articles. Patrick and Arthur weren't particularly interested in doing that, but Ellen was burning with indignation and felt that someone ought to do it. And she felt that that someone was Elizabeth Gaskell. Gaskell accepted this immediately because Ellen had put it to Patrick Brontë, who then put it to Elizabeth Gaskell. And within 5 weeks, Elizabeth Gaskell had visited Patrick Brontë and Arthur Nicholls in Haworth to begin interviews. 4 days after that, she went to Ambleside to interview another of Charlotte's friends, Harriet Martineau, in person. And then 3 weeks later, she visited Ellen at home to begin her interviews with her. These are all things that I uncovered as I was researching how Elizabeth Gaskell's biography was written. And as well as being interviewed in person and by letter, Ellen allowed Elizabeth Gaskell access to the hundreds of letters she'd preserved by Charlotte Brontë. But additionally, she wrote supporting material, not all of which has been published, about Emily Brontë. And we're going to look at a little bit of that. So here's a transcription of 1 page of a manuscript. I'm sorry if my box here is in the way, it may be. So Ellen wrote some short recollections. And when I say short, they're about six. There's two of them, one about 6 pages long and one about 4 pages long, specifically about Emily and Anne Brontë. And she'd written them when Elizabeth Gaskell had said that there wasn't much biographical material in terms of letters. Very few letters survived from Emily and Anne. So she needed a bit of help, essentially, a bit of background information. So Ellen wrote her recollections of them. We can see here, this is Ellen Nussey's, this is the actual manuscript that Ellen had written. And she says here, so very little known as Emily Brontë, that every exquisite detail awakens an interest. She talks about Emily Bronte's extreme reserve, her shyness, but also her power. She said that she was a person of considerable strength, some reserve, but considerable strength and considerable intellect. We can see here, if we look down, she had a strength and self-containment that Ellen had seen in no other person. She was in strictest sense a law unto herself and a heroine in keeping to that law. She and gentle Anne were often seen with their arms lacing each other in the younger days whenever their occupation permitted their union. Living statues of power. Remember that word, power and humility. On top of a moor or in a deep glen among the moors, Emily was a child. It's that word power that I'm very interested in, because it's often forgotten that these were women who were enormous creative talents, absolutely in charge of the material and absolutely in charge of their own creative instinct and absolutely committed to developing it to its fullest potential. Often they're seen as victims or as sickly, fragile people. They weren't like that at all, and people don't remember them that way. This is what the written record draws out, the actual white-hot recollections of those who'd known them. Here's another example, or two more examples from the other manuscripts by Ellen Nussey. On the one on the left there, the extract that I've put up says, Charlotte said Emily liked me because I never seemed to mark her peculiarities and I never pained her by treating her as a peculiar person. I remember after her death, Charlotte spoke of Emily having valued me next to her sisters. This was the nearest approach she made, I believe, to anything like friendship. The peculiarities is interesting there because it would suggest that Emily was used to people treating her as a peculiar person, reserved, probably very stubborn. Other people who Elizabeth Gaskell interviewed said much the same, that Emily Brontë was a tricky personality. We shouldn't expect anything less. This one on the right, Emily at home was a very busy and industrious housekeeper, doing all the ironing for the house and making all the bread. I remember books were a common sight in the kitchen as I passed the open door, but the use never spoilt the bread, for I don't recall such a thing as bad bread ever coming to the table in all the years I visited Haworth. Emily Brontë had more talents than writing, and she was an expert baker, apparently, according to Ellen Nussey, who remembered her producing all of the household bread continuously. So Emily worked industriously to run the Brontë household. There would have been a lot of washing and ironing without modern conveniences, and Emily Brontë was partly responsible for that. All the while, in her mind, living elsewhere, living in the world of Wuthering Heights, or in her juvenilia, the Gondel world that she'd created with her sister Anne. There's even more. This is still Ellen Nussey's handwriting, but we can see it's changed because she's becoming quite passionate. These are about Emily's dogs, Keeper and Flossie. We can see the top one here. I've transcribed it. The two dogs, Keeper and Flossie, were always in quiet, waiting by the side of Emily and Anne during their Scotch breakfast of oatmeal and milk. By Scotch breakfast, Ellen just means a simple breakfast of oatmeal, and always had a share handed down to them at the close of the meal. So Emily and Anne were feeding them secretly while they sat at breakfast. But sometimes Emily would delight in showing off Keeper, make him frantic in action and roaring with the voice of a lion. It was a terrifying exhibition within the walls of an ordinary sitting room. Keeper was a solemn mourner at Emily's funeral and never recovered his cheerfulness. You can actually you might be able to make out the word cheerfulness right at the very end of that page there, turning down. Again, these were Ellen's recollections, and if they seem familiar to you, it's because Gaskell then quoted from them or rewrote them for her Life of Charlotte Brontë, and then they entered the mythology of Emily Brontë. But these are the first instances of these appearing in terms of manuscripts. Bringing all of that together, was a huge task for me, and I had to collate it all the facts um, into a resource that I could then use and consult. And this is a spreadsheet, part of a spreadsheet that I used. This covers just 6 weeks between June and July, and it covers the period between Ellen Nussey drawing Arthur Bell Nicholls' attention to the article that she wanted him to correct, down to the 24th of July when Patrick Brontë contacts Elizabeth Gaskell to offer her the role of being Charlotte's biographer. And in this, I've got the date, the day of the week, actually, and it's sourced from the historical records. What I wanted to do was collate every bit of information that can be retrieved from history. Not all of it ends up in my book. The temptation of every historian or biographer is to put in everything they find out, but I couldn't. So much of this doesn't appear. But if you read my book, you will get the gist of it. We're coming quickly towards the end of my talk, and then we're going to take questions. So thank you all for that. And Mina, I'm going to report back to you for any questions that we might have. Thank you. I know that was a whistle stop tour, but I had to try and get in as much as possible.
I love it. In fact, one of the things you told me before we got started, because, oh, do you want to turn your slides off? I wanted to show
Sure.
people something. So
Yeah.
somebody came to your last talk with us and and loved it so much. She actually sent me a copy of Elizabeth Gaskell's book, and with a wonderful, wonderful note. But I wanted to point out, and you pointed this out to me, is that she has blue eyes in this one, and in your
Yes,
copy, she has
she
brown
doesn't.
eyes.
Well, everyone who's a fan of the Brontes, and probably most of the people on this call are fans of the Brontes, will be familiar with this painting that's on the cover of this book by J.H. Thompson, who was one of Branwell Bronte's friends. He painted this. This wasn't painted from life. It was painted long after Charlotte's death, and he's given her blue eyes, but there are written descriptions of Charlotte's eyes as being brown. And my publisher, the US publisher, when they published this, corrected her eye color to brown. So this is actually the very first time this image has appeared with the correct colour eyes. So I was quite proud of that they'd done that for me. So from top to bottom, I hope my book is a truthful approach, going back to the origins, discarding the myths and saying, this is what people actually said, rather than what the myths say. What the received wisdom is, this is what the historical truth says. Draw your own conclusions. You might not like it, but the thing, Mina, as you know, about history is that it's messy, it's complex. People often don't come out as heroes or villains, but they come out as very conflicted, divided people who have sometimes mixed intentions. Sometimes they change their mind. And in my book, that's what I show, how impressions and memories of Charlotte Brontë changed over time, and how everyone who'd known her had something of a stake in trying to shape her public image and then shape how history would remember her, not least of all Elizabeth Gaskell. But I hope my book resurrects all of that and shows people how that process actually happened.
Mm-hmm. I think it does. I've read it. It's wonderful. I think you've answered this question about why Gaskell's book was so shocking, so I'm going to skip over that one. But I'm not sure we actually got into this question, which you knew was going to come up from Dawn about, I think the Brontes are rolling over in their graves over soft porn version of Emily's book. It is sacrilege to Bronte purists. How do you feel about this?
I've seen the new version of Wuthering Heights, and not to damage Emerald Fennell's reputation, I thought it was fine. I don't think it's as controversial that the press are making it out to be. I think it is a triumph of marketing, but it's fine. You know, it's absolutely fine. If you go into it, if you understand this as a kind of entry point for many people who don't know or care about the Brontes, strangely, there are people in the world who don't know or care about the Brontes. I find that hard to believe, but they're out there. You have to understand that movie's for them. It's not for us. It's for those people. I mean, there are many Bronte fans who love it and they feel that there's something fresh about it. I don't believe they're rolling in their graves about it. This is about how we as fans have a sort of parasocial relationship to the Brontes. We feel close to them. But when there's a new adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, people aren't saying that about Lewis Carroll. They're not saying, oh, we must protect Lewis Carroll. Whenever there's a new version of Oliver Twist, I mean, think of it, a musical made about Oliver Twist and then an animation. So a novel about poverty and about gangs. And it was a hard world that he depicted in it, but softened over time into something like a musical. I don't know that people were saying Charles Dickens is rolling in his grave about that because people don't have that relationship with him. People are entitled to be offended by the new version of Wuthering Heights. But bear in mind how offended people were when Wuthering Heights came out. The novel offended many people. There were some reviewers who thought it was so, they didn't use the word pornographic, but so full of vice, as they put it, that they wouldn't even summarize what happened in Wuthering Heights because they thought it was so disgusting. And it's very interesting that we're having a parallel experience today, that people are saying something very similar to what people said originally about Wuthering Heights, that it was shocking, disgusting, some reviewers said, and that it was appalling. So history's repeating itself in a very unusual way. But personally, I think we should bear in mind that 27,000 copies of Wuthering Heights have been sold off the back of this movie in the last 4 weeks. I saw it in a cinema filled with people under the age of the 25 who were weeping. That movie's for them. And what they're doing now is going back to read Wuthering Heights. They're going to find a wider, more complex, deeper world within the novel. Be prepared, it's not a love story, but that's great. That is taking them back to the text. And for me, if that's the net result of all of this, that everyone returns to Emily Bronte's text, the job has been done, and Emerald Fennell has produced a success for Emily Bronte, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we were talking about this earlier, is that sometimes you just have to separate yourself out from the book when you see an adaptation because it's somebody else's perception or movement into a different
Exactly that.
area.
Exactly that. And adaptations are always different. I mean, if anyone has seen the movie Saving Mr. Banks, which is about P.L. Travers' experiences with Disney and how he changed the scope of and content of her novels to make the movie Mary Poppins a masterpiece in its own right, but very different from the novels. P.L. Travers, the author of those books, was not happy. But we tend not to see it in the same way. We don't feel protective of P.L. Travers in the same way as we do about the Brontes. Well, that's because we feel very differently about the Brontes. But the adaptation process is often painful for people who love the books, sometimes for the authors. It's a famous story about Stephen King absolutely hating Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining. But most people would agree that they are almost two universes. They're separate. And I think if we start to see Emerald Fennell's version of Wuthering Heights as being a sort of parallel universe version of Wuthering Heights, it starts to make sense because it has its own continuity and its own reality. It's absolutely not the novel, but you know what? You think of all the different versions of Romeo and Juliet or any Shakespeare play that you've ever seen. Some of them are set on nuclear submarines or set on Mars or something like that. We don't think Shakespeare's rolling in his grave because we're so used to this. We're so used to these new adaptations. Different creators will bring different things, different perspectives to the text. The definitive movie of Wuthering Heights is still to be made, and maybe the person who writes that script is on this call today, not me. Someone else can do it. So that's the beauty of this. Someone else can bring their vision and recreate the world of Wuthering Heights literally if they want to do that.
Mm-hmm. I just want to remind people, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. I am paying attention to the chat as well, but that sometimes goes by too quickly for me. But we're going to be here until about 3:15 our time to answer questions. So Jill asks, I think she's not in the meeting anymore, but Mrs. G wrote in the book that she wished Charlotte Bronte had spoken to her more about the pregnancy as she could have helped. Why did she not? Why did she not? Mrs. G was a good friend and had known about the pregnancy.
So Elizabeth Gaskell was told about the pregnancy not by Charlotte, but by one of the Brontes' neighbours, John Greenwood. There's a notorious letter from Elizabeth Gaskell. We don't have the neighbours' letters to Elizabeth Gaskell telling her about this, about Charlotte's death, but we have Elizabeth Gaskell's very shocked response, which says, "I wish I'd known. Had I known, I would have induced her to do the very thing that would have saved her life, even if that had made her family angry." We think she's talking about a termination. Now, the key thing to know about that is Elizabeth Gaskell was being misinformed. The neighbour didn't have all the facts. He didn't know that Charlotte was being seen by 3 doctors and was being cared for by 3 women actually in the household. So she had lots of care around her. the neighbour was given the impression that Charlotte Brontë died abandoned with two curates who were going, I don't know what's wrong with her. Who knows? That was corrected when she got to know Patrick Brontë and Arthur Nichols through conversations. But she does mention Charlotte's pregnancy in Life of Charlotte Brontë. She does, through Elizabeth Gaskell, we have the only description of Charlotte Brontë talking about the baby. She doesn't use the word pregnancy, but people didn't in that time because it seemed to be slightly indecent. Mm-hmm. But we have a description of Charlotte Brontë talking to Martha Brown about the baby to come, and Martha telling her, sort of cheer up, look forward to the baby that's coming, and Charlotte saying, oh, I will, but I just feel so tired at the moment. That came from Martha Brown, the Brontë servant to Elizabeth Gaskell, and Elizabeth Gaskell puts it in her book. So if we think that she hadn't been pregnant, Arthur and Patrick would have been able to have that taken out of the book, as they asked for other things to be taken out. They didn't, they left it in. And in fact, Arthur Nichols, when he did eventually speak about Charlotte Brontë's death, it's mentioned in the book, Charlotte Brontë and Her Circle, says Charlotte Brontë died of an illness related to childbirth. Mm-hmm. So it's very straightforward. But so in terms, going back to the question, why did Elizabeth Gaskell not know? There was just a lapse in their correspondence. Elizabeth Gaskell had last spoken to her, Charlotte, that is, in the autumn of 1854, and Charlotte died in March, and she was ill from January to March. So for most of that period, Charlotte wasn't really writing very much to anyone. So it's just something, it was just a lapse that happened. There was no other reason.
Okay. Anne-Marie wants to know, do you know where the artifacts Arthur took to Ireland are today? Did they ever make their way back to Haworth?
Yes, all of them have made their way back, I'm glad to say. We do know where every item is that he took back to Ireland. Most of them were sold at auction after his death. He died in the early years of the 19th century, 20th century, died in 1906, and he had a second wife. And she sold some of his Brontë artifacts. And then when she died, the remainder were sold. And they were things like manuscripts and paintings. It was his death that produced the two paintings. The one that I showed at the beginning of the Three Sisters had been rolled up and kept on top of a wardrobe. He didn't like that painting. We have his opinions on it. He didn't think it looked like any of the sisters, but it's debatable. The other artifacts included things like the diary papers by Emily and Anne Brontë, which were only discovered very late on, folded up into tiny squares and kept in a cash box. And he found them when he was going through their possessions. So they were returned via auctions. So people bought them. They went into the hands of private collectors, and then subsequently the Brontë Society and other university collections bought these manuscript materials from private collectors. So they are back in, I think almost everything is back in public hands in museums. There are still some things that are missing, incidentally, and we know what they are. For example, there's a painting that Emily Brontë made of two of her dogs and her cat all sitting together. And we have a photograph of it, but the painting has never reappeared, and it was hanging up in Arthur Bell Nichols's house, but it has vanished. It might still reappear. It might be hanging in above someone's fireplace. Who knows? It might be out there, but as far as the question is concerned, where is everything now? Basically, everything's now in museum collections. So we've been able to trace it all and then bring it back into museum collections.
Fabulous. Yasmin says, what a lovely slide deck and talk. Thank you. Can you tell us about the sisters' fascination with Scotland and the Highlands?
Yes, thank you for that, Yasmin. Hi, Yasmin and I have talked on Instagram. All of the Brontes were fascinated by Scotland, and I have a very slight Scottish accent. You might have been able to pick it up, but why? Because at the time when the Brontes were children in the 1830s, the Romantic era of literature was in full swing, and many of the writers of that era were Scottish. Walter Scott among them, Robert Burns, who was long dead by that point, had influenced lots of other people, and their writing was still revered. There was a very famous journal at the time called Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, and that was one of the biggest selling journals in Britain at the time. It was full of short stories and pieces, many of the writers were Scottish, and they presented very traditional ideas of Scotland. Heathery moors, men in tartan, women in plaid. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It actually still happens today, and there are still heathery moors in Scotland and ruined castles. But it was those elements, those romanticized elements, that really struck the hearts of the Brontes and captivated them. They were very excited by the wild landscapes in Scottish romanticism and the passion and the poetry of people like Robert Burns and Walter Scott. It swept them away and captivated them. And they felt it was wilder and more romantic than the world that they lived in. And it's ironic that it's in some ways flipped. Now that we imagine the Brontes live in this wild, romantic world, they didn't think that. They thought it was very boring and very uninteresting, and that they were the real romance was in Scotland. Only Charlotte visited Scotland. The others didn't have the chance. They all died too soon. But we know that they loved Scotland, and that's the source of it. It's their source of love for Scotland came through literature. They were all very influenced. I mean, I could do a whole lecture on Charlotte Brontë, the influence of Walter Scott and Charlotte, which was so deep, it's right down to her sentence structure. She structures her sentences in Jane Eyre very like Walter Scott, because she's picked up his vernacular and his phrasing. If anyone's read Jane Eyre, I'm sure everyone's read Jane Eyre, but she writes in clauses in many ways with lots of dashes. That was something that was very typical of Walter Scott's style. I'm not saying it was an imitation, it was more an unconscious thing that she did. But yeah, their passion for Scotland came through songs and poetry. And they played Scottish music. There was a piano in the parsonage. In fact, it's back in the parsonage, played by Emily Brontë. And Emily and Anne Brontë had collected music books, sheets of music, and we have them, and they annotated them. So we have their notes and the dates when they purchased this music. And we know that they played music, and they liked Scottish ballads, and they sang, and many people did at that point. That this was a way of entertaining the family. And so it's nice to imagine them doing that. People tend to think of the Brontes as being a very unhappy, depressed family, but they were happy for a very long time. They had their tragedies, as all families do, but they also were able to overcome those tragedies and allow the creativity that they felt that was inspired within them by much literature to then be re-energized into their own work.
Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit about the matriarch of the family? I don't think we've really talked about her.
They might mean the mother of the Bronte family, but the other matriarch of the family was Mrs. Bronte's sister, who was Elizabeth Branwell, known as Aunt Branwell. Mrs. Bronte, whose real name was Maria Branwell, well, real name, her maiden name, she came from Cornwall. She married Patrick Bronte and had 6 children, but she died shortly after they moved to Haworth. The youngest of the Bronte children was only a year old, was less than a year old, actually. Well, no, she was just over a year old. She was a year. Mrs. Bronte died in September 1821, so Anne was just a year and a bit, a year and 9 months. There's me counting very quickly. So what do we know about her? Charlotte had only a few vague memories of her mother, because she was only 4 or 5 years old when she died. Charlotte had 2 elder sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, who were older and who knew their mother very well, but they died as children, aged 10 and 11. So had they survived, perhaps living memories of their mother would have circulated better within the household, I think. Charlotte wrote about her mother. She had some letters belonging to her mother and some belongings, which thankfully are now preserved. But we know her to be a kind woman and a conscientious woman, a woman who was concerned about the poor of the world. She was religious, as all the Brontes were. She was a Christian, and she was devoted in her Christianity as well. So I often wonder how it would have been when we think of these parallel timelines had their mother survived. I think there would have been a very different dynamic in the Bronte household. But the unsung hero, in my opinion, of the Bronte story is her sister, Maria Branwell, Bronte's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, who gave up her entire life to come to Haworth to look after the Bronte children, the 6 Bronte children as they were growing up. An extraordinary thing to do then and now, but then as well, she could have had quite a nice life, but chose to give it all up. out of duty for her sister, her deceased sister. And I think she was a great stabilizing influence in the household. So I think of her as the matriarch of the Bronte household.
Wow. So Mitchell asks, when was it actually revealed to the public that the sisters were actually the authors of the novels? Did this occur with the advent of Gaskell's biography? Was it already known? Was it an open secret? Oh, I think you're muted, Graham.
What a very good question, Mitchell. Thank you. I'm glad to say I answer this in my book, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë. It happened within Charlotte Bronte's own lifetime, after the lifetimes of Emily and Anne. Emily died in 1848, Anne died 6 months later. Charlotte lived until 1855, so she lived 6 years longer. And they were actually exposed by an American. Interestingly enough, I think I'm the person who discovered this. I don't think anyone knew this. Essentially, what happened was that it appeared in newspapers that Charlotte Brontë, the daughter of the Vicar of Haworth, was Currer Bell. This was appeared on front page news headlines. How did that happen? Well, there was a man who had lived in Haworth and who'd emigrated to Massachusetts. And there was lots of press about the Brontë novels at the time, and everyone seemingly was reading their novels, and he recognised lots of locations in the Brontë novels and wondered whether they were the places that he remembered. He'd come from Haworth, coincidentally. And sure enough, he added it all up and thought, it is this, these are by the daughters of Patrick Brontë. And he wrote to a local newspaper suggesting that. It was picked up by London newspapers who reported it, and sure enough, of course, it was true. So Charlotte was essentially outed by the press, the London press, in I think it was 1851. So then visitors started coming to Haworth. We tend to think of that happening much later, in maybe the 20th century. It's extraordinary to think that it happened in Charlotte Bronte's own lifetime. So the first visitors, the first Bronte tourists, were coming when Charlotte Brontë was still living in the parsonage. They were looking over the wall, trying to spot her in the street and asking people to point her out in church and things like that. And she was baffled by the whole, and amused by it all. She thought it was unworthy attention. She did say that people were going on the very unwise errand of coming to Haworth to see the landscape of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. I don't know that the Keighley Tourist Board would like that statement, but nevertheless, that's when it happened. It happened in Charlotte Bronte's own lifetime, and it was the press who exposed them.
Mm-hmm. We are coming around to like the last few minutes. So I'm going to try to get to at least one more question. Jessica asked, do you have any idea why Charlotte chose to edit much of Emily's work, both her poetry and Wuthering Heights, after Emily died?
Yes, we do know that. When Emily died, well, after a few years after Emily died, actually, her novel Wuthering Heights and Anne's novels Agnes Grey and Tenant of Wildfell Hall were kind of drifting out of print. They had a publisher who were not terribly conscientious in terms of promoting or even publishing their work. Their books were filled with errors and typos. And they ripped Anne and Emily off. Charlotte had a different publisher who took care of her more. And she was writing to Emily and Anne's publisher saying, where are my sister's books? They don't seem to be available anymore. We can follow the pattern of this. And she decided, after speaking to Elizabeth Gaskell, actually, in 1850, that she felt aggrieved that their work was disappearing, and also because they were dead, that they hadn't had the lengthy careers that they deserved, and they were drifting out of the public consciousness. And she thought she would perhaps write a little recollection of them. So she approached her publisher and said, it proposed the idea of republishing Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey with a recollection by her. They agreed and said that they could produce a sort of remastered edition, a director's cut version that they would publish. But because both Emily and Anne's work had received much criticism, Charlotte was put in charge of essentially correcting all the typos and editing it. So she did some creative editing. But we have a letter from her saying to her publisher that she isn't an editor and she doesn't really know what she's doing. Why did they let her do it? Because they didn't have to pay her, basically.
Mm-hmm.
If they'd brought it in-house and had to get their own publisher's editor to do it, that would have increased the costs up. But as they considered it Charlotte Bronte's idea, they just put it all down, gave her the full responsibility and didn't pay her to do it. She did protest, I'm not an editor, but I'll do my best. Nevertheless, Charlotte's been castigated ever since for this because people have interpreted this as a way of her trying to censor her sisters or to sabotage their work. It absolutely wasn't that at all. It was incompetence. I mean, I use that word incompetent in my book. She was the first to admit that. But a myth of this kind of a bad faith view of Charlotte Bronte grew up in the 19th century, the late 19th century, that she was a sort of saboteur, that Emily Bronte had perhaps written a second novel and Charlotte destroyed it. That's got a lot of currency. It has no evidence in the written record that Emily had written anything. But we can see the beginning of that myth again, looking at the historical records, coming from someone who was frustrated that there wasn't enough material by Emily and Anne Bronte, manuscript material, that he could sell on the open market, and thought to himself, I bet someone got there before me and destroyed it, and I bet that was Charlotte Bronte. And just from that guess, the bad faith view of Charlotte Bronte grew up through the 20th century, that she was this pyromaniac destroying her sister's work. It's absolutely not true. We can tell from what survives today is what Charlotte Bronte found. There is manuscript material missing, but it seems to have been destroyed before Anne Bronte died. So it could have just been that Emily and Anne disposed of it themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of corrections, Charlotte's were incompetent, but they were well-intentioned, is what I would say.
So I think the pyromaniac is actually Jane Austen's sister, who destroyed all of her original things.
That's right. Cassandra Austen threw everything that would be of interest to biographers into the fire. Mm-hmm. And isn't it interesting that even someone at that point in the early 19th century understood that some material wouldn't be safe in the hands of biographers, that it would get out there into the world and there'd be no way of taking it back. And it's interesting because people like Elizabeth Gaskell knew about this. They knew about previous controversies with Jane Austen. Byron, there was a huge controversy around his private letters being published as well, which were very scandalous. So none of this was done without an awareness. It was done, Gaskell's book was published to create controversy. It was just much more unmanageable, like a Twitter flame war. It got completely out of control, and she and her publisher had to act very quickly to diffuse it. Mm-hmm. The consequence of that is that Gaskell's reputation has suffered ever since.
Yeah. So we are about out of time. I just wanted to say, this is amazing. I know you've spoken extensively about the Brontes now with your book coming out, having come out. And I just wonder what's next for you. I mean, are you going to like write a vampire story or something to kind of get away from it altogether?
Well, romantasy apparently is the big thing at the moment. No, I'm writing my next book. There will be more about the Brontes, about a different part of their lives as well. So I don't know when that's coming out yet. I'm still researching and writing it just now, but you may have gathered I've got a lot to say about the Brontes, and I've still got more to say.
That's fabulous. Because I could have you here every month. It would be something new every time. So Graham, thank you so much again for doing this, and for everybody who's been here with your wonderful questions and thoughts about the Brontes and the writing. So I hope you all have good reading if you pick up the Brontes again. And Graham, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you to all who've joined. Thank you so much.
Yep. Have a great day, everyone. Oh, yeah. Have a great day, everyone.